I think that was my only job that night, was to be a witness, to go ahead and try to help, to try to make comfort the last minutes of his life.
That night, what I remember the most is the sound of the explosion. My friends didn't really have a chance.
These are memories of one night from almost 7 years ago.
I still search, for something to make sense. Why am I here? Why did I get to live?
Things are dangerous, and we look at them and we think, well, it hasn't happened. I'm not scared of it. We'll be okay. Well, it happened.
What happened that night and the months and years ahead has largely been out of the public eye. In this exclusive investigation, Fault Lines, along with the Center for Public Integrity, tells the story of the Tesoro Anacortes explosion. April 2nd, 2010. Just after midnight, 7 operators at the Tesoro Refinery began to start up heat exchangers, equipment filled with highly volatile matter.
Skagit 911, what's your emergency?
The refinery just blew up.
Okay, what are you seeing?
Flames, giant flames.
Skagit 911, what's your emergency?
Yes, there's a big explosion at the refinery.
We have a report of that. Thank you.
Inside the refinery, John Moore says he heard a sickening rumble.
Skagit 911, what's your emergency?
The foreman from the cat cracker came running into the control house and said, quote, this is bad, everything's on fire up there.
The refinery lies just across the water from the island town of Anacortes, Washington. Many of the residents say they heard the explosion in their homes, including an off-duty employee, Maria Radine. You were at home, right?
Yeah. And I jumped up, I knew it was the refinery, because what else would it be? In my mind, it's always the refinery. You're always jumping into action. And my ex was saying, you don't have to go. You don't have to go. And I was like, I have to go.
So main gate is Dave.
Hi, Dave. This is Cindy at Skagit 911. Is everything okay out there?
No, we've had a small explosion and a fire over near the benzene project. Don't have a whole lot of information yet.
Do you know
What's up with the sirens over? We heard we thought it was an earthquake.
There's been a small explosion over there. We're trying to figure out further what's going on. We don't have any...
A small explosion?
Yeah.
We felt it in our house.
As I was driving out to the refinery, it was just quiet, like dead quiet in the town. I mean, you could see it from town. You could see it jumping off and reigniting in the sky like fireballs.
Could you see it when you were driving in?
Oh, yes.
You saw fireballs?
Oh, yes.
2 highly flammable substances, hydrogen and naphtha, had ignited at more than 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Moore says he desperately tried to reach any of the operators by radio, with no response.
The crude board operator turned to me and he said, John, they were all up there. And the horror hit me. Oh my God.
And what did you think?
Surely somebody's up there that can answer me.
A few of the bodies were still on fire when some of the first employees reached the scene. The fire burned for more than 3 hours. One of the operators, 34-year-old Matt Gumbel, managed to stumble out. Radine says she found him lying naked in a fire blanket.
His teeth were burnt and charred in front. His skin was milky looking. He was swelling up because he was cooked, literally. And I'm like, oh, Matthew, where is everybody? And he was, they're all outside. He was, I don't know how they made it.
All 7 operators would eventually die from the explosion. It was the single largest industrial accident in the state of Washington ever. To this day, the company that owns the refinery, Tesoro, is disputing its role in the accident.
You've reached Matt Gill at the Anacortes Refinery. I am either away from my desk or unable to take your call.
Hi there, my name's Josh Rushing, and I work on a show called Fault Lines. Tesoro is headquartered in San Antonio, Texas. Their media department at first directed us to trade associations that represent big oil companies. But we kept pressing for someone at Tesoro.
You have reached the Tesoro media line.
Happen to be in Anacortes, want to know if we can get on the refinery today or tomorrow. We're here for the next couple of days. Thank you. The investigations into the explosion and Tesoro's role would take months before questions could be answered. In the meantime, the horror of what had happened continued to unfold.
These are all 4 days after the accident.
This is Matt Gumbel, the operator who had stumbled out of the fire.
And when people ask me how much of him was burned, I tell them it's easier for me to tell you what wasn't burned. Part of his chest, part of his back, but the rest was...
Most of his face wasn't burned.
Yeah, it was, honey.
I know it had some burns, but most of it wasn't burned.
Over 22 days, the family was never able to speak to him. Ultimately, they said the doctor told them that Matt would have to be on machines for the rest of his life.
And I stood there and I said, no, that's not what he would want. And my husband said, but I'm not ready. I said, neither am I, but it's not what he would want.
The thing about it is, mainly, the material that was inside the exchanger.
Paul Gumbel, Matt's father, kept interjecting into the conversation.
Paul, it seems like you got something to say about this. You want to join us over here?
All I'm gonna do is get pissed off.
Paul also worked for the Tesoro Refinery and was in another unit when the explosion engulfed his son.
Actually, hold on. Let me come over there. I'll come back to this. That's fine. Come here. I want to hear this.
So, I started walking in, and off to my left, I saw somebody burning. Dead, obviously, but burning. And I thought, oh, crap.
After coming across several burned bodies, he realized it was his son's team. He didn't see Matt until he got to the local hospital, right before they flew him out to Seattle.
They had him covered up, kind of, so I could still see most of his skin, and it wasn't good. That was a hell of a night.
Do you have flashbacks?
Yeah. I used to dream about it every night.
How's it affected you?
Me?
Yeah.
I have PTSD, and I'll never get rid of it. I never know what's going to set me off.
Sometimes it's something I did or I said. At times it's something on TV. Politics are a big one. They really set him off. We don't watch the news.
We've always been a really close family, and it's not easy, and it hurts my feelings sometimes.
The counselor sometimes wonders, too, if he's not always really nice to Amy, and she wonders sometimes if it's because she's here and Matt's not.
What all did you lose on that day?
My son. My husband. My life as I knew it.
Matt Gumbel was the last of the 7 operators to die.
Did Tesoro or anyone at Tesoro ever take responsibility for the accident?
No. And when we met for Elle and I to go over the violations and the fine, the very top line says this accident could have been prevented. And I just went.
We didn't read anymore after that.
Hi, Mike. This is Josh Rushing from Fault Lines. Can you hear me? Michael Silverstein, now retired, oversaw the investigation into the explosion for Washington State's Labor and Industries Department, or L&I.
And the equipment there, we found, had been weakened by nearly 40 years of exposure to extreme chemical and physical stresses that resulted in cracks in the metal that could have been discovered, in our judgment, with proper testing and required testing that had not been done in more than 10 years.
Those cracks in the metal led to the rupture of a heat exchanger the night of the explosion. A federal team from the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, along with L&I, found that Tesoro failed to properly test the equipment. The federal investigation also cited flawed industry standards and regulations. But both reports pointed to years of a lax safety culture within Tesoro, putting workers directly at risk. Ultimately, L&I slapped Tesoro with a nearly $2.4 million fine and 39 willful violations, meaning the company had acted with knowing disregard or plain indifference.
And while the company did a lot of monitoring and testing, there's no doubt about that, they did not follow the requirements carefully enough, and they knew that they were operating right on the edge of catastrophe. They made those kinds of decisions repeatedly over the years.
The Anacortes Refinery shifted hands from the Shell Oil Company to Tesoro in 1998. According to the Chemical Safety Board investigation, some of the inadequate safety testing was a continuation from Shell. But we talked to longtime former employees who claimed that safety was less of a priority under Tesoro.
Hey, Steve.
Hey there.
Josh Rushing with Fault Lines. How are you?
Nice to meet you. I'm good.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Your concerns would be just dismissed. This is our place, right? We'll note that, but we're not going to talk about it anymore.
Steve Gary worked under Shell and Tesoro at the refinery and was part of the workers' union for 25 years.
But back in the early 70s, we were all coming.
He says safety standards and holding oil companies accountable have been a long fight.
Tesoro and the rest of the industry would have workers believe that process safety, the kinds of things that are more the responsibility of the corporation to get right, were not something we should concern ourselves with, not something that we should, that we would benefit by knowing more about. We know now how false that is.
He claims Tesoro, from day one, has offered little transparency into the 2010 explosion.
It began to be very hardened attitude and keep your mouth shut attitude, and we're not going to talk about this anymore attitude. But I found Tesoro to be very determined to try to control access to information and to make it very difficult to get access to information.
Hi, Josh. This is Destin Singleton returning your call from Tesoro. Sorry.
A message from the corporate office at Tesoro indicated we would not get an on-camera interview.
I don't think we'll be participating, but at the same time, if you could tell me more about the production, who else you're talking with, what is it you would like to know?
In 2014, Tesoro and Shell collectively paid about $39 million in a settlement to the victims' families in a wrongful death lawsuit. A Shell spokesman declined to comment, and Tesoro says industry standards were flawed, not their actions.
What do you think would be different today had they done the inspections that they were supposed to?
They would have replaced those units, they wouldn't have had that explosion.
And how would your world be different today then?
Well, I would have a daughter.
Estes Powell is the father of Catherine Powell. On the night of the explosion, the family was told to go to a Seattle hospital to see her.
And then after we got to Seattle, the most ice-cold individual you ever want to meet in your life came up and met the family and told us that she had been burnt over 95% of her body, and they didn't expect her to last over the next hour or so. No sympathy, no nothing, just cold as an iceberg. She was wrapped up from the top of her head all the way down to her feet. She was wrapped. Her toes were exposed. And that was the way that we knew that it was her. Because, excuse me, from the time she was a little girl until the time she was a grown woman, she painted her toenails. And there's those painted toenails exposed. And we knew it was Katie.
Does it feel like there's been any sort of justice for you in this?
No. Attorneys and so on got settlements through the different ones and so on like that. But I would have lived on a lot less if I'd had my daughter back. There is no amount of money that could replace her.
Even today, Tesoro's actions continue to anger Powell. Tesoro is fighting the state of Washington and refusing to pay the fine.
They really resist strongly because they do not want to be characterized as having willfully violated the law, especially when there have been fatalities.
Did Tesoro ever accept responsibility?
They made some changes and enhancements and improvements in the equipment when they rebuilt the operation. They did change to some extent they changed their behavior. Now, did they acknowledge that they engaged in willful behavior? No, they've never done that.
I would think it would be easier for them to become part of the solution and to try to reassure the community and others that they take this issue so seriously that they also want to make sure it never happens again. But then again, I'm not a senior executive that stands to enrich myself when the share price goes up. So I don't pretend to understand what drives those people.
But you believe it sends a clear message to their workers?
I think the message being sent is that they concern themselves with their own best interests internally first and foremost.
Tesoro's operations are just a fraction of the country's 141 oil refineries. Two federal agencies oversee national safety regulations: the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA.
This is an EPA database of reportable accidents. These are accidents that reach a certain threshold. Somebody's hurt, somebody's killed.
Jim Morris at the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, D.C., has been analyzing this database for our story. His team counts about 500 accidents in the last 20 years, but that's likely an underestimate.
There's no comprehensive database of not just major incidents like Anacortes, but minor incidents, near misses. So what you're left with and what we're looking at here is mostly the big stuff.
Not far from Morris's office sits the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, a small federal agency that's pushing for change in the refining industry.
Are there enough safety regulations when it comes to oil refineries?
Absolutely not.
The board offers recommendations through investigations, but it can't regulate like the EPA or OSHA. Board member Rick Engler says a big challenge is the industry's pressure to produce.
Shutting down part of or all of a major refinery unit costs an enormous amount of money. And so there are pressures not to do so from management and from the nature of the industry itself.
By and large, and there are exceptions, but by and large, the philosophy in the refining industry is push it until it breaks.
It makes you wonder how many other
On top of this, federal regulations have not been significantly updated since the early 90s. The EPA says it will introduce new reforms in early 2017, while OSHA says it is still several years from a safety update.
But are the rules strong enough? Absolutely not.
Why? Why isn't it being done?
Why isn't the oil industry doesn't want it, and the two agencies that could do something, the EPA and OSHA, haven't so far been able to get anything through.
Well, I think it's fair to say, and again, I'd just like to qualify that this is my own view and not necessarily official views of the board as a whole, that the oil industry is one of the most powerful industries in the United States, has historically been that, has exercised enormous economic and political influence, and it should really come as no surprise that they have been able to significantly influence the progress on safeguarding the public.
In the refining industry, Tesoro isn't the only company to face scrutiny. But it has come on the Chemical Safety Board's radar more than once. In 2014, the board investigated Tesoro's Martinez, California refinery, where 4 workers were burned by sulfuric acid. The report showed similar accidents had occurred for years and claimed Tesoro failed to use equipment that was known to be safer. Tesoro ultimately denied our request for an on-camera interview. We still traveled down to their headquarters in San Antonio to see if we could speak to the man who's overseen Tesoro since 2010, CEO Gregory Goff.
Can you let him know that I'm here?
Actually, everything's appointment-based zoning.
Okay. All right. Does he work here? Does he work in this building?
I can't even say that as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks.
One of the questions we wanted to ask is if Tesoro supported a culture where workers felt safe to speak up about safety violations. The current employees that we reached out to declined to be interviewed on camera.
Does that sound like the kind of safe environment that you're describing?
No.
Does that
Job
sound like
fear is an enormous problem, and we recognize that. I think the federal OSHA has recognized that whistleblower protections, employee protections for speaking out about safety have been fundamentally broken. OSHA's made some steps in the right direction to try to better protect employees, but ultimately this is a continuing challenge.
In a written statement, Tesoro told us they take the investigations into safety seriously and have and continue to improve operations across all their refineries. But the company says L&I's conclusions into the Anacortes explosion are mistaken. Tesoro's appeal of the violations is still pending.
I want them to give one of these organizations like CSB or OSHA the teeth to actually enforce the regulations that are out there. There's no one to go in and say, you're not following these, we're going to shut you down until you fix it.
I want people to remember what happened. I don't want it to happen again. So if I have to tell my story till the day I die, I will.
Why was it important for you to speak to us?
Somebody has to tell the story. And if everybody refuses to talk, nobody never knows what happened. You only have Tesoro's side of the story.